So, thanks everybody for being here, and thanks especially to the organizers. We are going to have now a roundtable with the Doctora Melina Castellum, Doctora Susana Ramirez, Dr. Esteban Withrington, and myself. And the aim of this roundtable is going to have some discussion around the topic of representations and enactivism, the role they play in cognition, and different paradigms. So at the end of the talk, the idea is that all of you understand why representations are so important and why we should reject enactivism. I'm just joking. So no, the idea is to have a discussion to motivate different views and to learn from different paradigms. Okay. How it's going to be organized? So we're gonna have like two blocks. In the first block, we're gonna discuss a little bit about the notion of representation and the notion of intentionality. Then we will exchange a couple of short questions and move to the second part devoted to perception and action. Then a short discussion, and then we will open the Q&A. Okay, so that's how it will be organized. And no hablo mal inglés, parece. So, a few words on mental representation. Here is one well-known paradigm in cognitive science that is known as the representational theory of mind. What is the main idea in the representational theory of mind? The idea is that cognitive process, cognition in general, involves the transformation and storage of information-bearing structures, what we call representations. So if we have a look at this, the first thing that we should try to clarify is this idea of information. What is meant by information? Well, the idea that is behind that is the idea of semantic information or semantic content. And we can understand that in contrast with Shannon's notion of information. Shannon's notion's information intends to measure how much uncertainty is constrained, okay? Or if you prefer, how much the entropy is reduced, the chaos. So there are a bunch of possibilities for us, and what a piece of information makes is reducing this kind of uncertainty. But it measures the amount of uncertainty. And what we will be interested here is in this notion of semantic information that is qualitative, and it tells us the way in which uncertainty is constrained. Here's one example. Imagine that I throw a coin, and you don't know if it has landed tails or heads, okay? By telling you, so there are these two alternatives, and if I tell you that the coin has landed heads, this uncertainty is reduced to the half, okay? Now, the same happens. Imagine that what I do, rather than a coin, what I do is I throw a dice, and you know whether the dice ended odd or even. And I tell you it ended in an odd number. So the uncertainty is reducing exactly the same amount. So these two messages carry the same amount of information. But the semantic information, what is conveyed in those cases, is different. So the message that the coin ended up in heads and the message that the dice ended up in an odd number are different semantically. And the way in which we characterize this semantic information is in terms of correctness conditions. So if I tell you that the coin landed heads, and indeed the coin landed heads, then this information is correct. And this is, so here's one example. The idea that we use is similar to the way in which we see the newspaper. So this is another example that says from El País, one journal said that half of Spanish people are afraid of losing their work by the crisis. So this is the message. It carries certain information, and the information is correct or incorrect depending on whether indeed half of the Spaniards are afraid of losing their jobs. It is important here to pay attention to the fact that it's not only sentences. So we typically, in order to express this information, we're gonna be using sentences, but we would have something similar if we have a map. So a map is a representation and carries information, for example, about the city of Cuernavaca, and is correct or incorrect depending on whether this map corresponds to how Cuernavaca indeed is. Or a picture. Think of a picture of the people attending the conference. You know? If suddenly I Photoshop it and add somebody, then the information that the image carry would be inadequate or incorrect. So now when we have these representations, so we have like two things: the content of the state or the information the state carries, what the state says, and then typically in this paradigm, we distinguish the content and the attitude. So, for example, my belief that it is raining in Cuernavaca is about Cuernavaca, and it has a certain content, but the very same content that I believe now to be the case can be something that I desire. I desire that it rains in Cuernavaca. So we have different attitudes toward the same content, okay? And we can have different attitudes to different content, like believing that it's raining in Cuernavaca or believing that my car is parked outside. So what are representations? So representations are those states that have adequacy conditions, that have semantic content. And it is also interesting to pay attention to this notion of intentionality, because in the representationalist way of speaking, they are sometimes treated as synonymous. So the intentionality of our mental states, the intentionality is the property that mental state has to be about other things, external things. For example, my belief that it's raining in Cuernavaca is about the city of Cuernavaca. So it has this weird property that's being about other things. So what is the object? In this case, the city of Cuernavaca, whereas the content would be something like that it rains in Cuernavaca. But there are, as we will see in the case of perception, there are characterization of mental states that account for the intentionality without committing to this kind of representations. Well, that's it. We have representations, but now the question is, okay, now we have more or less an idea of what are those representations, but why do we need it? So, sorry, I was in the previous slide. So these mental representations are internal states that have this semantic or intentional content, in the sense that they are about something and they carry information, and this information is exploited in behavior planning and guidance. Here are examples that I have mentioned of those states, like beliefs, desires. So my belief can be correct or incorrect. For example, my belief now that it's raining in Cuernavaca is incorrect. My perception after taking certain substance that there is a blue dragon inside the room is incorrect, but sometimes my perception now that there is a microphone on the table is correct. And there are other states, and some people have wondered whether those states are adequately characterized in those representational terms. Think of cases like pains or orgasms or emotions or moods. This is a complete different question. I just want to present first cases that seem to be clearly representational in the sense that I have mentioned, and other cases for which it is not so obvious, to say the least, that they involve some sort of representation. And now the question is, well, now that we understand what representations are roughly, okay, why do we need representations? Okay, and now we move to motivate a little bit some arguments in the literature to motivate the introduction of representations into cognitive science. Esteban can continue.
I think I need the mic.
Oh, es verdad. Sí,
Sí. For people, right? People online. Right? Hi, perfect. Okay, so what we're going to do is review some of the most classical arguments for the existence of representations, right? So classically, Fodor, one of the main advocates of the use of mental representations to explain our mental lives, appeal to folk psychology. Folk psychology is our common sense theory about other people's minds, right? That we use basically to understand other people, to explain their behavior and to predict it. And as Fodor pointed out, it seems to postulate precisely mental representations, that is, inner states with properties, like these intentional properties being about things, having correctness conditions, this semantic properties, and also certain causal powers, right? Now, crucially, the causal powers involve in some way guiding behavior or governing behavior, but of course they play causal roles in relationship to inputs from perception. There's causal interconnections between these inner states with these semantic properties or intentionality, etc. Now, the best explanation of why our folk psychology does work, how we manage to actually understand each other's actions, predict each other, explain how we, how others behave, is that it is roughly right, that it gets things roughly right, that we do have inner representations with semantic contents that do play these causal roles and have these causal powers. It's basically an argument for the best explanation. So based on this, Fodor argued that as scientific psychology, we should expect it to actually vindicate these core features of folk psychology. And he pointed out that, the new cognitive psychology was already devoted to playing our mental lives in representational terms. So that will be like a further argument for postulating representations that, as far as cognitive psychology seems to be working, it must be that there really are these things. And he also pointed out something interesting, which is that for naturalists, which is that mental representations would have to be physically realized in agents or organisms. Why? Because insofar as they have this power of guiding behavior, which ultimately is expressed in terms of bodily movements, of course, a physical effect can only have a physical cause by well-known principles of physics. So we would have to have physically realized mental representations with semantic powers so that explanations actually have the explanatory power. They can actually govern behavior. So now let's think of an example. So let's suppose that Mary goes to the fridge, to the kitchen, and opens the fridge, grabs a beer and drinks it. And we can perfectly explain why she did that she wanted to have a beer, and she believed that there was a beer in the fridge, right? Okay. Now, that kind of explanation is actually ascribing certain inner states that have this kind of correctness conditions that Sebas was talking about, and that have causal powers, right? So the desire of Mary and her belief actually caused her to go to the fridge, right? And this seems to work very well. And imagine for a second that we didn't have this resource. How could you explain what Mary did without ascribing to her a way of representing the world and certain wants or desires? It will be very difficult. Fodor actually argued that this is the only viable model we have, at least in as folk psychologists in everyday life, to understand each other, and that we use it all the time to coordinate our behaviors one with each other, right? We ascribe our mental lives with these like beliefs, intentions, etc. Okay. Now, another very similar argument that has the same overall shape was given by Dres, but he focused not just on like beliefs and desires of human beings that involve the use of concepts, etc., but on the mental lives of animals. So he discussed many simple examples where we similarly need to ascribe inner states with informational content or semantic content and certain causal powers to explain how animals behave. And one thing that is interesting that he pointed out is that it's not enough that we have a certain inner state that causes a certain bodily movement and thus carry information about something else, but that the semantic or informational properties should actually be involved in the explanation of why that inner state causes that bodily movement. So unlike Fodor that said we need these two kinds of things, he said these have to be properly connected in a certain way. These two main features, which is causal powers and information or semantic content. Okay. Closer to home, more recently, Nicholas Shea, in his book on representation in cognitive science, again makes an argument with the same overall structure, that we need mental representations with these kinds of two features, like semantic properties and causal properties. But his focus is not on our fault psychology applied to human beings, neither on full, but on these subpersonal representations. Like how in cognitive science and the neurosciences, you need representations to explain how visual information is processed, for instance, right? And there they also seem to be successful, and you have the same overall argument to the best explanation. But the interesting thing is that he discusses, like Dresky, that it's not enough that they have these semantic powers and causal powers. Additionally, you need a reason to believe for a system to be genuinely a representational system, that the way of describing it as a representational system gives you a better explanation of behavior than otherwise. So think of a rifle. You could say, look, the trigger moving backwards is an input. The output is the bullet going outwards. And in the middle, you have the firing pin that moves forward. Why not take that as a representational state? It mediates between an input and an output, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, you could describe it as representing something like that the trigger was moved backwards. However, you don't gain anything, right? This is just a gloss, it's a way of describing it, but you're not gaining any explanatory power. What he proposes that we need is representation to be better, right? To explain, for something to be a real system that has really representations, that description has to be better than the one you could give just causally, right? So for instance, think of a frog that snaps at a fly, right? You could describe it causally, but the frog will snap eventually at just shadows or things, right? When it gets things wrong. And there's something that we can do by ascribing representations, which is to explain the success or failure of that goal-directed behavior, like prey catching, based on whether its representations about the presence of prey are actually correct or incorrect. So it looks like we have this kind of overall argument that's repeated across the literature for a couple of decades, focused on folk psychology, on animal behavior, and subpersonal states. Yeah.
So we have seen like two motivation, one based on false psychology, one vindicated by the way in which we do based on cognitive science, why it's required to postulate the idea that certain states are representational if we want to provide us an explanation of satisfactory behavior. But there is also a further motivation based just on our conscious experience. So our conscious experience are for us a primary source of information, and they are thereby representational. So if I don't know whether there is a microphone on the table, all I have to do is to look at that, and the kind of experience that I have will provide me this information. So these kind of states constrain uncertainty, and the information, as we mentioned before, is true or false depending on what is conveyed by this phenomenal state is correct or incorrect. And there seem to be, for example, some information associated with the phenomenology, with the phenomenal character of the experience. If any of you were to have an experience phenomenologically identical to mine, there would be some information that we would share, and that's sometimes called phenomenal information. So here we have like these three motivations for psychology, practices in cognitive science, an explanation of correct behavior. So explanation, successful behavior and consciousness. Now, just to finish in a couple of minutes, I would like to mention, to clarify the relation of this representational theory of mind with some other features, like for example, some other ideas, like for example, functionalism and computationalism, because they should not be confused. So on the one hand, we have functionalism. The functionalism is the idea that mental states are defined by their causal role within the system. So What individuates a mental state, according to functionalism, is a certain kind of functional role, where functional role isn't understood as a causal role, not as an teleological role. And then we have computationalism. So according to computationalism, mental processes are computational and are based on the symbolic manipulation according to certain rules. Okay? And finally, representationalism. So representationalism is the view that conscious experience and mental states are characterized by their representational content. Okay? Now, this representational theory of mind is typically considered in some computationalist account because you manipulate syntactically these features and you thereby make connections between content. So far, so good. But there is no commitment to that. So the representational theory of mind is perfectly compatible with computational approaches as dynamical system and biological or phenomenological representational theories. So it might be the case. So one might think that a certain mental state has the content it has because it satisfies a certain causal role. But one can also, for example, that a certain mental state has the content it has in virtue of the phenomenology, for example, or the other way around. So one might try to characterize the phenomenology in terms of the content. Or, for example, one might think that this causal role is not sufficient in order to get the content. And one needs, for example, some sort of causal history. So that was just the last thing to mention, how we should dissociate these ideas, despite the fact that there are relations among them. And now our colleagues.
Sebastián,
Dime, perdóname.
Can you mention some examples about the three distinctions that you are making in real life?
You mean real theories?
No, como algo muy aterrizado.
So here I have this mental state, and this mental state, here's one idea. This mental state. But those are theories, those are not examples. So one theory that says that this mental state, this is the kind of mental state it is because it is connected to this and connected to that, and it causes this and this and that, and it's caused by this and that. This is functionalism. Computationalism says.
I know that theory, but I want to ground the theory with some
example of a mental state you're talking about.
Yeah.
But it's there's not gonna be so. Okay. So here's the question is not that there is some state that is functional or some state that is computational or some state that is representational. What we try to characterize is cognition. And one can be a functionalist about cognition, and one can be a computationalist about cognition, or one can be a computationalist about some states and not others. So I'm giving you an example of what somebody might take to individuate a certain mental state. But there is not like, oh, you should be a functionalist about these states, or you should be a computationalist about those states, or you should be a representationalist about those states. Families of theories. So I can, if I can
I chip in?
yeah, no. So no, let's better move to the discussion. And you see, so yeah. So we keep questions to the end, and then we clarify. Okay, so please. So just highlights. Yeah, so we have agency. I'm not going to tell what this agency is. Whatever you take to be intuitive, that would work for us. We take perception, and here are like two naive views of the things that we are contrasting. And the only thing that we wanted to mention is that this way of seeing things is significantly inadequate. Like one according to which perception may involve internal representations completely decoupled from actions, basically because probably what it takes to have a representation depends on what the system can do with that, according to most theories, or at least half of the theories. Just here also, I wanted to mention how representationalism and enactivism are by no means the only things in town. So we have relations like naive realism, according to which perception is a direct relation with objects. Enactivism, according to which there are views that might be more close to representationalism, more close to like realism, requiring some relation of acquaintance. Some people like this acquaintance and like particular object to be constitutive of the state. For some other people, don't like them. In the case of perception, one obvious reason is the case of illusion. So illusion is one of those cases that there seems to be something wrong. And I have the same kind of state despite the fact that there is no object. So, and on one spectrum where we have something radically inside, in the case of the sense data, like Brazilian sense data, and we are acquainted with these internal things. And here is this, I think, that naive view according to which for enactivism, action and perception are two sides of one process, and for representation it is something completely isolated, and that's why these kind of representations called push-pull-you that are postulated, while one of the main proponents of naturalization of representations, who is Ruth Millikan, those are states that are at the same time descriptive of the world, and they command. Also in cognitive science, in recent work by Nick Say, he has this command that represents not only describe how the world is, but they command certain action. So it's just the only thing that I wanted to say, rather than defending something or other, is showing that naive views do not capture the kind of process that we are interested in. And we cannot have, in many times, and sometimes yes, and sometimes not, information that is completely taken apart from the kind of behavior that they typically elicit. They elicit in normal conditions. And what we try to do is to unpack what normal conditions are, because this is not the kind of vocabulary that we can use in natural sciences. So I was also expecting some kind of articulation of all these normative notions to be articulated in terms of something like very simple on how it works. And just to give an example, let us present one of the explanations very, very briefly, please, on how the one example works.
Well, this is an example of a representationalist explanation. It's not philosophical, it's from cognitive neurology, and this is one of these kind of textbook examples where we know the most about how a system actually works, and we can explain it in representational terms. So toads, this is the nice thing is that this is very similar to the fictional case of frogs eating flies. I don't know of any frogs that only eat flies, but philosophers invented them. But in real ethology and neurology, it turns out that toads eat lots of invertebrates, like insects of all kinds and slugs and worms, etc. So they visually discriminate them. So this is a visually guided behavior. Toads discriminate or categorize, neurologists and ethologists tell us, moving objects as either prey items, predator items, or other items, and respond with different behaviors to items that they classify as one of these things. Of course, for others, they just don't do anything, but for predators, obviously, they try to avoid them. They engage in prey avoidance behavior, and for prey, they engage in prey catching behavior. So, the most developed studies by Ebert and his colleagues have shown at the ethological level that the specific stimuli that are involved in prey recognition require an object to be small, elongated, and moving precisely in the same direction, which is elongated. And so think of all of these animals that they eat, they are all elongated and move in that direction. Prey animals don't move perpendicularly to their elongated shape. Okay, and neurologically, they have shown that the specific neurons that respond to these stimuli are the so-called T52 neurons on toad's optic tectum, which make like a topographic map of the full visual field, one for each eye, actually. So it's two sets. So those are the neurons that get activated precisely when there's, in the normal toad, there's a stimuli that is like a properly prey-like, called worm-like stimuli. And furthermore, neurological studies show that the activation of these cells directly causes patterns of behavior, triggers motor systems in the brain, that includes several patterns of behavior. Like first, if it's on the left side, for instance, the prey item, it will move towards the left. If it's far away, it will approach, and when it's close, it will snap its tongue. I'm simplifying it a little bit, but those are kind of the basic patterns. Okay. What is represented? Well, there's lots of philosophical debates about precisely what is represented, but what neuroethologists tell us is that what's represented is an object recognized as prey when a T5 neuron fires. That's what they explicitly say. And they, like Everett describes those trying to catch the little prey dummies of cardboard that he used to study toads as representing it as a prey animal, therefore misrepresenting, right? This attribution of content is very important to explain behavior because it's prey catching behavior, what they're trying to explain, and also applies beyond neuroethology. So for instance, a behavioral ecologist or a field ethologist will characterize toads as being victims of deception when they're victims to the puff adder, which is a snake that stays still so that toads cannot see it. Toads cannot see things that are not moving or not classify them as predators, at least, which is what the snake wants, right? And only moves its tongue in a worm-like fashion, attracting toads and eating them. So if what's represented is that the object is a prey item, then there's a case of misrepresentation here, which neatly helps to explain failure in the behavior. Just like when it's actually a prey item, we can explain the success in the behavior in terms of the truth of the representation. Yes. Yeah. How much minutes do I have? 2? 1? 2. Okay. 1.5. Okay. So I just wanted to point out that the full system is dynamical and complex under sensory motor sequences. Everett is the most computational representationalist example in neuroethology. He describes things that we cannot get into now in computational terms about how these neurons are activated, etc. And he interestingly points out that the T52s activating are not only involved or exhibit prey recognition properties, like represent the world as being a certain way, but they also have this command content. They tell the frog, move to the turn to the left, approach, snap your tongue, right? The very same neurons. Oh, yeah. And each command executed will change the relationship of the toad with the environment so that it will create a new perception. Prey item at the left, command, turn left. Now, that is what will produce a perception of prey item right in the middle of your visual field, which will trigger the command, approach. And the representation of the item as close will trigger the command, snap your tongue. So there is a loop between perception and action that produces the conditions for the next perception, etc. Okay. I think I'm on time. I just wanted to make a, do you have half a minute? 30 seconds. Okay. So that's a different example. Those representations are innate. Here we have some very important acquired representations. Play cells in mammals, we have them. They've been studied mostly in rats, represent the place where an animal is, the place that the animal recalls having been there before, right? They are activated when animals in a specific spot, right? For instance, a rat in a specific corner in a maze. They are activated by plenty of stimuli, visual, tactile, etc. And they play a role in memory and guiding behavior. So, for instance, a rat will, a successful path that led the rat to get food will be replayed while the rat is resting or even sleeping as a sequence of play cells being activated. That sequence represents a path, or that's how scientists tend to take it. And furthermore, a rat, and we also can do that, of course, can pre-play potential future paths by pre-playing sequences of these play cells. And then, based on that, plan the best road to get to their food or something else. So again, we seem to have these states that are triggered by certain stimuli and guide behavior that have intentional properties and causal powers.
And we ignore that.
Let's ignore that. Yeah, good.
So